And now I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the Dean of the Architecture School, Rodolphe El Curry.
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to introduce myself and say a few words about the School of Architecture before we move on to the next program. One of the defining strengths of the University of Miami is our commitment to interdisciplinary collaboration. This conference is a prime example of that. So I take the opportunity to thank Dean Paul Pavlou of the Miami Herbert Business School, Dean Patricia Abril of the School of Law, for joining us with their teams, including the formidable Andrea Hewson, in sustaining this effort. At the School of Architecture, we take great pride in the Master of Real Estate Development and Urbanism. This program has been a guiding light in our approach to graduate education. It has pioneered experiential learning, integrating internships into coursework, promoting hands-on engagement with the profession, and embedding real-world impact into the curriculum. The program has been a model for innovation, influencing the evolution of our other graduate programs, which have emulated its most successful features. Much of the success of this is due to the vision and leadership of Professor Chuck Bowl, who has built the program into what it is today. Through his dedication, MRED+U has become a benchmark of how design and real estate development can be taught and practiced in an integrated way. So it is a great pleasure to announce that Professor Bowl is now the Tony Goldman Director of Real Estate Development and Urbanism. I'm using this title now for the first time. This newly endowed directorship, made possible by a generous gift from the Goldman family, honors Tony Goldman's enduring legacy in urban transformation, and also recognizes Professor Bowl's remarkable contributions to education and the profession. As the inaugural recipient, he is the perfect embodiment of the values that this endowment seeks to celebrate. I also want to acknowledge other gifts that will further strengthen the MRED+U program. One from Ricardo Caporal, who now chairs the board after Avra Jane's fabulous tenure. Another one from the Adler family, and a third from Bob Miller and Furst, Florida. All three will fund scholarships for our students. These contributions make it possible to attract top talent and provide meaningful, full support to the next generation of real estate leaders. Finally, I want to express my sincere gratitude to our advisory board members and conference sponsors. Their continued support and engagements are essential to the success of this program. Through their commitment, they provide students with internship opportunities, mentorship, and professional networks, reinforcing the real-world impact that is at the heart of the MRED+U. I now turn to one of our most dedicated board members, who will moderate the next discussion and introduce the panelists. Joe Furst is founder and managing principal of Place Projects, a Miami-based real estate investment firm, operating partner, and placemaker focused on reimagining the real estate landscape through development, planning, and content curation. His current real estate portfolio includes several residential, commercial, and retail developments throughout Florida, including Wynwood, West Palm Beach, Doral, and St. Petersburg. Joe.
Whatever you want.
Rather than me stand up here and give long-winded backgrounds about and introductions about our panelists, we're going to sit down and let them do it themselves but I will make one comment. Just going back to Tony Goldman, this is a conversation about placemaking. This is a conversation about the future of cities. And Tony Goldman had an expression that was very near and dear to me, which is vision is daydreaming with your feet on the ground. And I think that I try to take that into my work, and I know that these gentlemen take that into theirs. So let's get this started and have a good time. Thanks.
Andy Gloor.
Hey everyone, Andy Gloor, Sterling Bay Companies. We're headquartered in Chicago. We develop industrial, multifamily, life science, and office. We have about $8 billion of assets under management. Vertically integrated. I'm like a one-trick pony. This is the only job I've ever had. I can't do anything else, and I'm excited to be here and talk about it. Thank you,
Great.
Joe.
Thank you. Josh?
Hi, good afternoon. Josh Sirefman, CEO of a project in Detroit, Michigan called Michigan Central. Michigan Central is the result of a $1 billion+ investment from the Ford Motor Company to create a real epicenter of talent and innovation and propel Detroit into being a world leader again 100 years later after the last time that it really occupied that position. Unlike Andy, I've had multiple things, although the theme through all of them tends to be crazy, complicated, large-scale real estate that's super difficult but transformative in its outcomes. Before Michigan Central, I co-founded and built a company, one of Alphabet's other bets, called Sidewalk Labs, focused on urban innovation. I've led large-scale projects a lot in New York, a number of years working for Mike Bloomberg in City Hall when he was mayor, ran development at Brookfield Properties across the country. I'm old. That's the takeaway.
Okay, great. So let's start a little bit more with you, Andy. So I had the good fortune of meeting you and getting turned on to Sterling Bay's work in Chicago when I was doing a lot of the Wynwood work. And really, you are who I wanted to be when I grew up. Because I think that...
Shoot higher.
Well,
Sorry.
maybe. Now that I know Josh, maybe you've been replaced. But the principles of placemaking, revitalization, and how you developed the Fulton Market neighborhood in Chicago, could you give some background on the original vision and really more background on you and how you came to be a subject matter expert in doing this type of work?
Yeah, so when I started at Sterling Bay, there's 4 of us. Obviously, there's a whole lot more now. And for people that know Chicago, Fulton Market was our version of the meatpacking district. It had an industrial zoning on it, but the buildings had great character. It was really authentic. We were lucky enough to get Google to take basically the biggest building in the market. We had a wonderful mayor at the time, Rahm Emanuel, who quickly changed the zoning to accommodate Google. And once we knew we were going to do that, we ended up buying 31 buildings and sites within 6 months. We didn't have a business plan for that. We just thought that the Google would have a great effect on the neighborhood. It was a neighborhood that was really close to the train. It was kind of in between everything, yet it was all meat packers. And so that was about 8 years ago. And since that, we've developed about 1,000 multifamily units. We built McDonald's headquarters. Google's had 2 buildings for Google. And it's Chicago's had some headwinds, as it's no surprise to anyone here. And the bright spot for Chicago is definitely Fulton Market. It's a market that has the highest rents, the lowest vacancy, the lowest crime, and those types of, going back, when we first did the Google deal, I wanted to have the tour in the afternoon because all the meat packers are there in the morning. I thought he'd be scared away by it, but sure enough, it was 8 a.m. We did the tour, and he looked at me and said, "You know what, Andy, whatever you do, don't make it too perfect. Keep the sidewalks a little off. We like the grit. We like the authenticity." And that's a lesson that we've carried out through our projects throughout the country.
Yeah, and for anyone that's had an opportunity to visit Fulton Market, that's very clear. One follow-up, just in the current state of Fulton Market, and you obviously taking the lead on office, another thing that Andy didn't mention is they have a full hospitality company and own and operate their own restaurants. Thinking about the future of cities, what elements, what uses, what changes would you make to Fulton Market today to see its future in the most flattering light?
So I think, if you look at the city in general, the loop needs to be reimagined. And I think a lot of these cities that, there was a reason why lawyers needed to be next to the courthouse and traders next to the exchanges, all that's gone. And so I think if you look at Chicago, it's just, you can't take a couple buildings and make them residential and think you're going to fix it. You have to have dramatic change. You got to tear down a bunch of buildings and create green space. You know, I think Fulton Market, one of the benefits is half the neighborhood is historic, and so you can't build on it, so it's going to keep the density a little lower. And in general, I just think that, you know, we don't have the answer in Chicago yet. I don't know who does, but you can't do this halfway. It requires, you know, a wholesale change as to how we look at the loop.
Understood. And Josh, you have a super unique situation where you have a single-family organization who was able to invest over $1 billion to create a sense of place in an ecosystem around technology and innovation, autonomous driving. As you've thought about, again, what uses go where and why, and how you take that project to the next level to accomplish those goals of economic growth, what are the things that you focus on the most, and what do you think you need to take it to the next level?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because Ford, and it's Ford Motor Company dollars, though the Ford family obviously has a strong connection with the company. Unlike a real estate entity, Ford spent the money in a way that an automotive company would think about large-scale capital projects. Nothing to think about building a multi-billion-dollar battery plant, for example. And so the project starts with 2 fairly large buildings. It's about 1 million square feet of space, but it's different than that. The centerpiece building is a former train station, and those of you familiar with Detroit, it's a building that sat empty and abandoned for almost 40 years. We like to call it, became a temple of culture because it was raves and videos and all graffiti throughout, all kinds of things. But it also became this hulking, rotting symbol of really beyond just the death of Detroit, the death of the American city. Like, you go to Germany and you see pictures of the Michigan Central train station in Detroit, sort of like the peak urban ruin porn. And so the money came in to renovate that building in a really amazing warehouse, Albert Kahn design warehouse next door. And I say this, Joe, because we don't have the luxury of starting with small increments. And you know, the amazing thing is that through COVID, Ford continued to spend the funds to renovate the buildings. There's no interruption at all. You know, the mindset is just very different than a traditional real estate mindset. But as a consequence, I can't start with one little piece and then sort of grow and grow and grow. So to make this sort of big bang start, we have to think about everything. So in one building, we're focused on growing a community of startup and early stage companies. And I was telling Andy before, we in almost 2 years, under 2 years, we've attracted, we've got 140 companies, we've got 1,000 people in the building. Half are coming from outside Michigan, around the country, around the world. It's probably the most diverse tech ecosystem in the country. Over half of founders or CEOs are women and or people of color. There's like incredible energy, and you know, you have to remember Detroit hasn't seen a lot of positive market activity in many, many decades. So we've got to focus on that. At the same time, we open the train station, which is this massive building. You would not build it today unless you were building a casino, where you have this massive podium of a building, these grand spaces, and a tower above. So we have a range of strategies to activate those spaces, to pull people. We managed to have, we opened that building in June of 24. We had an amazing concert, a lot of Detroit artists and talent. We had Eminem, Diana Ross, Jack White. I could keep going. It was amazing, but it was sort of captured the energy of what's happening in Detroit. But we're doing lots of things to pull people. We've had 200,000 people come through the building since then. I've got 4 floors occupied in the tower already. We have a hotel deal underway that we'll be announcing shortly. So for us, we just have to go and do everything, because if we let our foot off the pedal at all, it'll fade too fast.
Understood. So I think one thing that's similar about the projects that I like to work on and the work that you guys have done is really looking at places that have great hardware, right? And I think when we think about the future of cities, it's the reutilization of space, revitalization of space, and then the software component, which to me is the content side. Clearly, you're leading with tech and innovation to create a sense of place. You've done it with office, food and beverage, et cetera. Before we get to all the fun elements of what we do, I'd like to talk about the new 4-letter word of politics, and really how much local government can play a factor, positive and negative, in your work. And Andy, why don't you start with Chicago? And then
How long do I have here?
You can go on as long as you'd like.
I mean, listen, I think we were talking about it. We're both friendly with our old mayor, Rahm Emanuel. And he's a good friend, and you know, just because he made it look easy, it wasn't easy. You know, when we built McDonald's headquarters, we needed a permit in 4 weeks. It usually takes 8 months. He got it in 4 weeks. If you needed to call a CEO, he called a CEO to recruit him. We haven't had that in about 6 years. So I think, you know, there's certain things that the public side can do that we can't do. We can't issue permits. We can't do infrastructure. We can't do tax breaks. And then they can't, you know, and then from a private standpoint, they need us. And so I think the city, you know, you have to ask yourself, like, what is the city giving to you? And I think what's happened since the pandemic, a lot of like Chicago and maybe New York to a lesser degree, but you have the highest taxes in the country. And you have, you know, politics has been kind of anti-business. Now, it's changing now, and I think the current mayor is doing his best, but it's really powerful if you have a very effective government and you have some productive private citizens, because what you can do together is pretty amazing. I mean, you know, it's so, I would say it's a huge part of it, and it's not perfect right now in Chicago. We definitely have to fix that.
I'll actually take that for a moment just to make you not feel like Chicago's the only challenging place.
Yeah.
When I started on my own endeavors, I was also concerned about the framework of politics in Miami, and actually looked around the state for places that might have more interest in helping big ideas. And Palm Beach has absolutely been that for me, where they really opened arms for what is the best idea and how do we help you execute it. When businesses come down, there's a whole team of people that fly around the country and facilitate meetings with all the business leaders, organize all the state tax incentives, create local tax incentives. It's been a tremendous, tremendous asset. And even locally, I think it's interesting to add, if you think about in Miami, the projects that have had big infrastructure projects, how much public participation really took place in those. It's not a lot. Whereas in Palm Beach, for example, all of our infrastructure, underground and all of our power lines for resiliency, et cetera, all of that is reimbursed through the CRA. So very aggressive with trying to ensure that these cities grow. So if you could just kind of touch on some of those same topics and give us the perspective from Detroit.
Of course. You know, I think to your point, to me, in addition to all of the things that government needs to make happen, the impact of real leadership that has vision and is not afraid of doing big things, I think for our industry, has massive impact. And you know, similar to the experience with Rahm Emanuel, I think those of us who worked with Mike Bloomberg didn't fully appreciate at the time what a unique and special experience and moment that was. And you know, especially factor, we came in immediately after 9/11, and so we had this sort of crisis mode, and crisis allowed, in New York at that time at least, it allowed us to think big and different in a way that maybe perhaps absent that sort of massive jarring of the system, we'd not be able to. But that big vision, and you look since, in you know, Mike, since Mike's been out of office, the leadership in New York's been a disaster, and there's no big things have happened. And you know, for development, for real estate, when you have leadership that can say, we want to embrace big ideas, we're going to sort of set some parameters. There's a lot of complicated stuff to balance. It's an incredible experience. You know, I had a different experience also with Sidewalk Labs, and you know, and Joe, you can tell me to stop here, but you know, going down a different path here, I also think our industry is probably the least innovative of most out there. And so at Sidewalk, with backing from Alphabet, we tried to take entirely different approaches to how do you undertake development. And we tried to do a project at a sort of district scale in Toronto. In hindsight, we picked Toronto, Canada. It was probably the most difficult regulatory environment, cultural environment to do something, but in a way that was sort of the right kind of construct. And the ability of government to think differently was just impossible. You know, we were, one of the things that we were really focused on was the use of timber as a different building material, and to use timber to build tall buildings. And you know, we would have these working groups with 3 levels of government. We'd have 45 people in a room going through the tiniest details, and you know, after a while you start to think, we're never going to get there. We're never going to be able to do something different. So, you know, I keep going forever on it, but public, like strong public sector leadership who understands placemaking, who understands how to spur and catalyze and manage development is key to everything in my view.
So when all of the successes happen and things go as planned, there's a series of consequences that are both intended and unintended. So of course, in creating economic development, you tend to create higher rents, affordability becomes an issue, transportation to those jobs or that economic development becomes an issue. Let's first tackle affordability. Here in Florida, of course, the big news is the Live Local Act, which most of the developers think is a great tool. I have a slightly different set of opinions, but affordability in Chicago, what has government done to ensure affordability in your projects? How important is it for you to have mixed income projects so that you can create an appropriate economy of workers and people within the district?
I mean, I think as everyone knows, there's a housing shortage in every city across the U.S., and particularly with affordable housing. So Chicago has a program, there's tax abatement available, up to 20%. Affordable units in a particular deal can freeze taxes for a period of time. There's a certain percentage of them you could buy out. The point is, if you looked at the last 4 or 5 years, due to, I think, a lot of the mismanagement from the city, you've produced a paltry amount of units, I think a couple hundred a year. So I think, right now, they're trying to streamline that process. They're trying to ensure that you get the tax abatement, because without the tax abatement, the numbers just don't work. And you're starting to see a number of projects in the pipeline that are going to kick off that are going to help. I just think right now the math doesn't work quite as well as it did a few years ago, and hopefully that will change, and you'll see a lot more cranes in here.
Is there anything that you know of outside of the subsidies that you mentioned, some of the tax credits, et cetera, that you think would be a great addition that local government should be focused on to create more affordability?
I mean, listen, there was a program that died somewhere in City Hall, and it was these mini houses. And so they're all modular. They were made in Chicago. You can literally crank out like 20 houses a day. From per square foot standpoint, it was about a third of what it cost to do normal construction. And for whatever reason, it just didn't happen. So I think we need to rethink, how we do affordable housing. A lot of times, the thought is you want to make sure it's on site. But if you talk to a lot of people, they like their neighborhood. And so I think you have to do a combination of some on site and then some in the neighborhood. And if you look at Chicago, a lot of the retail is dying and the residents aren't living there because they don't have any new housing. So I think you have to keep an open mind. There's a lot of ways to solve it, but Chicago has started, but it's got a long way to go.
Okay.
The other thing on that, in addition to whatever financial programs and all that Andy's mentioning, I personally think there needs to be investment, public sector to catalyze private sector investment in tackling the cost to build. We talk a lot about programs to sort of make it feasible, but we never talk about things to actually say maybe the fundamental economics can be changed. And so whether it's tiny houses or modular or timber, or there's a whole bunch of different things. But you look at a market like Detroit, where the cost to build is similar to a Chicago. Frankly, sometimes it's similar even to almost like a New York market. And the economic, it's just simply never going to happen unless we can attack that also.
So I heard a staggering statistic. I hope this is accurate. This was from yesterday, but that Dale Gilbert and Bedrock owns 18 million square feet in downtown Detroit.
Yeah, I think it's 130 something buildings.
Right. So over those 130 something buildings, for those of you that aren't aware, Bedrock gets a lot of the credit, I think rightfully so, for the resurgence of Detroit, and has capitalized many small businesses, local entrepreneurs in the food and beverage space and other to really repopulate the downtown. What is the city doing from a housing perspective to ensure that those people have a place to live? And then we'll get into transportation as to, are there any larger transportation framework and network initiatives that the city is undertaking?
Yeah. Well, the reason that Dan was able to do that is because the downtown core of Detroit sort of skipped decades. And so what you had for, really from the 1980s on is an almost empty downtown. And so most of those buildings were unused, and so very little, and maybe there's 2 or 3 buildings built downtown in the time from then till now. So you don't have a big displacement issue in the downtown. It exists in other circumstances, but so that sort of all that Bedrock's done is really additive to the city. On transportation, there's nothing. It's a huge issue. And as you can imagine, Detroit historically had a trolley and a streetcar system. However it happened with the auto industry, that went away. there was a lot of pressure against it, and there's never been anything since. So that's why we have a little pilot going that I think, for me, like represents real long-term opportunity, which is, what you have in Detroit are big streets and no legacy infrastructure to overcome. And so we have a pilot of an autonomous shuttle actually partnered with Bedrock in the city of Detroit that can go multiple points, and ultimately it's the perfect canvas in Detroit for a autonomous, on-demand shuttle kind of transit that can go wherever and maximize efficiencies, and I'm a true believer that we're going to get there.
Understood. So again, not to touch on the four-letter word of politics, but something interesting that I want both of your perspectives on. It was recently announced that the Department of Transportation should be allocating funds to areas that have higher birth rates and marriage rates, which against the national average, which when you look at those areas, they tend to be suburban areas and not necessarily urban. Can you talk a little bit about what you think some challenges with that might be and how we can focus also more on micromobility within cities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's early days, and again, I want to stay away from politics, but I think that's part of a more suburban-focused set of aspirations and agenda, and I think that's, my personal opinion, I think that's terrible for cities. And I don't think you can think about transportation investment in isolation of thinking about how do you have healthy regions, healthy cities, which means also having not just the core city, but everything around it. Thinking holistically, transit needs to be thought about holistically. So I will say I haven't seen yet anything about what other kinds of changes to federal funding, but it does concern me that there wouldn't be, we need the federal government to really lead on pushing the next generation of infrastructure capabilities, and not just fixing roads and the like, but literally investing in how do we, I think somebody on one of the panels before was talking about AI, but there's so many capabilities now. We have to invest heavily in what does that transit of the future look like? And cities have to be the core piece of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, 80% of the country lives in cities, urban areas. So I think that you have to focus on those. And I think the last 4 or 5 years since the pandemic was really hard on a lot of cities. I mean, crime spiked, people did remote work, and a lot of these cities, need a little support right now. So I'm not exactly sure how the allocation is, but I would be heavily in favor of focusing on the biggest cities in the U.S.
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit before about in a post-COVID environment, of course, the trains, the crime, things not being as well kept as they once were. Are there any big initiatives right now in Chicago to address that, or is that something that is sort of part of what needs to be addressed?
Yeah, it's addressed. So the gentleman that ran that CTA stepped down a few weeks ago, and I think to address exactly that, they need to be safer primarily. They just need to run better. And I think since the pandemic, a lot of people are hesitant to get into a bus or a train with 100 other strangers, and so I think that needs to change, not just in Chicago, but throughout the country. And so hopefully we'll get that right.
Yeah, you guys obviously are experts in Chicago, in Detroit. Andy, we had the good fortune of being partners on a project in Wynwood 545 Wynn. We are in Miami. I think we do need to talk about some Miami-centric issues.
Yes, let's do it.
So let's do it like this. Pre-COVID, it seemed to me that every conference like this that I went to, the only topic of conversation was sea level rise. And now, post-COVID, I don't think that word really exists, or at least it hasn't been used quite as often. When you're making investment decisions and thinking about the future of cities and thinking about being more exposed and having more work in Miami, how much are you thinking about resiliency and sustainability?
I think the biggest issue for Miami, from talking to tenants and trying to recruit businesses here, is education. I think there's been such an influx since the pandemic of people down. There's just not enough quality schools for kids to get into. And if you look at these businesses and these families who are thinking about coming down here, they love the economy, they love the lifestyle, there's everything they like about it, but they need to make sure that their kids can get into a decent school. So I think that's one. And I think two, and listen, every big city has traffic, so I'm not saying it's worse here, but it's getting pretty bad. And so, I don't know how you resolve that. I think some cities like Nashville, they just can't fix it because they just don't have the space to do it. I think here you do, and hopefully with the Bright Line, et cetera, that's going to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. How about for you?
I'm probably the least qualified person to talk about Miami in the room, but that's never stopped me. So happy to. I don't know. I look at that great presentation before us, and I look at those maps, and I think like, holy shit! Why is not everybody like completely panicked? It's incomprehensible to me. And why isn't there like aggressive, smart strategies being developed to figure this out? Because the place is sinking. So I don't know how to think about that beyond that. The other thing I would say is I feel like you see this a lot with cities where when there's rapid growth, and I know I think Miami actually might be losing population, but there's been such growth in the last decade, at least economically. It kind of becomes, there's like a tendency towards a little bit of like Wild West and a little bit of like lowest common denominator. What I mean by that is like, if you look at like lots of cities where there's massive effort to get development in neighborhoods that haven't seen it for decades, and you put a strip mall in and it's a triumph. And the bar is set low. And my reaction to Miami is that there's been all this energy and investment, and there hasn't been thinking about how do we actually think about managing that and think holistically about the city and the county and the full area and have real strategies for that. You know, I find it confusing that downtown still feels like this sort of hole in the donut that there's no strategy for. And so, you know, whether it's traffic, whether it's the environmental issues, it just feels chaotic in the ways that maybe shouldn't be.
Understood. I want to talk a little bit more about urbanization, right? And so clearly in Miami, we have tremendous traffic issues. There are many of us locals who are born and raised here like me who are plotting their escape when they can. But you know, affordability and access and transportation, the idea of the 15-minute city and being able to be in close proximity, how much of your work at Michigan Central is based around that? And do you have plans for additional housing and really the enhanced urbanization of what you're building there from an ecosystem?
Yeah, very much so. So we have a total ourselves of about 30 acres of property. It's not 100% contiguous, but there's pieces, and then we have other entities that we are talking to about partnerships. And so the hope over time is to have new development at real scale. As part of this and completely mixed use. Frankly, I'd love to see us develop at the neighborhood scale in a way that maybe doesn't even exist yet of how we think about radical mixed use in our building materials and other things. It's all a part of the ambition and the aspiration. Detroit is still at a point where it takes real complicated gymnastics to figure out how to make it work. And so, you know, we're starting to see value creation happen from the work we're doing. But so I think this is probably a 10, 15-year proposition. And we have an opportunity to create something in Detroit. You know, downtown's very walkable. There are neighborhoods that are, but physically it's a huge city spread out. And we have an opportunity to shift the paradigm a little bit in how development happens. You know, the 15-minute city, I remember in COVID that all of a sudden became the rage. And I think there's a lot of circumstances where it's wonderful and it makes a ton of sense. It sort of also, by definition, you then have to think about how do you make all places within a city sort of have that same set of resources and experiences. I don't know, it just feels like fundamental good thinking and good planning to sort of, people want to live that way.
Understood. And Andy, just going back to Chicago,
Yeah.
Obviously you were instrumental in bringing Google, bringing McDonald's back to the center of the city. My understanding is a lot of that is driven by employee retention, employee enthusiasm, and obviously having that worker base that wants to be at work. What are the next steps of that for you in Chicago now that the people are living there? Obviously you have some exciting things to do. Has there been post-COVID a flight of businesses that have sort of wanted to leave the urban core and do more suburban office? Or do you believe that trend is going to continue even with the challenges of transportation and affordability that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think, we look at office buildings as a tool to recruit and retain. I think it's a competitive advantage. There's so much transparency in comp right now that how do you differentiate a smart young engineer coming out of school? You put him in a really cool building that has a lot of amenities and a neighborhood he wants to hang out in. So I think, although there will be successes in the suburbs, not just in Chicago and other markets, I think the city's powerful. I mean, it's just from a transportation standpoint, just from the arts and entertainment, the restaurants, it's just, you know, the sporting, it's always going to be the draw, in my opinion. And if you're trying to, there are some businesses where they don't really care if they're recruiting the top talent, and then, more commodity businesses, they're, taking the NPV of the rent. If they, if you save them a penny, they'll go there. But I think for Chicago and these other cities, you have to get some of these high-value companies to go into these cities, and they're just not doing it right now. And I'll applaud Google. Google took just an awful building in Chicago and is dumping a whole bunch of money into it and thousands of jobs, and that's going to make a material difference in terms of how people view the loop, and I think accelerate the development.
Yeah, no, and in Detroit, the holy grail in Detroit is to attract net new corporate activity. And, so we're not just moving the pieces around. And, we're starting to see it now at that startup and early stage level. But to get that kind of corporate presence, that's a major and critical next step.
Understood. So let's change. Do you want to add to that,
Yeah,
Andy?
so it's also interesting. So we're working on a deal now where it's a Fortune 500 company, and they're going to invest in a multifamily deal, and they want to essentially provide the housing for their employees and this nice building, and it provides a next level of stickiness that if you're going to leave your job, you really want to leave your job and move. So it's just interesting. They're trying to create like the new age company towns, and so proximity in that regard, I think you're going to see more and more of that going forward.
Okay, understood. So something that I've always struggled with in my work as we sort of enter a very digital age, and the way people utilize their phones, the lack of human engagement, people existing in the digital world. Your work previously at Sidewalk Labs clearly touched on that. Could you give some more thoughts on how you view the future of cities related to technology and the digital in the physical world?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I think about it is it's not about what kind of cool things can you do in using an app or this and that. It's about the capabilities and how do you leverage those capabilities for city building, for all the things that we have to do. And it should create an entirely different set of tools for how we build, how we manage places, how we interact and experience things. I don't believe for a second that the fundamental human interest and tendency to be social, to be in a lovely environment, like all those things, that is unchanged. People don't want to be in a thing where it's just about fancy technology. But our ability to do these things, there's so many tools at our disposal now that some we're starting to see, really what the capability can do. Others, we have no idea what AI can do. And rather than, we shouldn't just fear it, we should really aggressively figure out what does it mean. So I think that's true for every way that you think about the digital and the physical. And I think we're through, you saw a period where just having scooters in cities was oh my God, micromobility is going to save us. And I think we're through that, and now it's a much more thoughtful, how do you actually use technology to create a better product?
And Andy, what blew me away the first time I toured your assets in Chicago was really how advanced the creative office model was and how much technology was within the space. And you've made tremendous strides, I know, post-COVID with air purification and other elements of office design. Could you go into some more details on what you think about the future of your development projects using technology, and then, of course, anything else that you've done more at the ground level for the human experience with technology in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first started building a lot of these creative office buildings, it was a amenity arms race. And so, we have pools, we got pickle courts, we got bowling alleys, we do all sorts of crazy stuff. And our whole theory is, you work a long time, and you have to go into these soul-crushing 8.5-foot drop ceiling spaces where you'd spend 9-10 hours a day, and it's just not good for you. I don't think it's as productive. So we added these physical amenities, and it was great. Now the next arms race is all services. So if you want your dog walked, if you want your dry cleaning done, and so it's not purely altruistic for these businesses. Obviously, they want them focusing on their job, but it's all handled through the app. It's very compelling. So a lot of our younger people are never going to cook a meal or drive a car, and you're kind of catering to them because ultimately those are the kids that you want to recruit and retain, and that's the evolution that we've been seeing.
Actually, on that note, I'd love to get your thoughts on autonomous vehicles, given that's one of the key initiatives that you're focused on at Michigan Central.
I think autonomous capability is going to I think it's going to get to where that level 5, which is the no driver at all, complete autonomy. I think we're going to get there. I'm a believer in that. I continue to be slower than I'd originally thought. But you see the autonomous capability applied in a lot of other ways too. And so it's not just in vehicles. It opens up a lot of opportunities. And so for me, the interesting part is how do you think about how cities can handle that and accommodate that, and what opportunities does it create, and how we think about our roads differently and our allocation of space on roads and what it means for buildings, therefore. And there's a domino impact that could be really interesting.
And did you find in your previous work working for Bloomberg that cities were actually taking the initiative to address these types of issues? And as you've continued to study it further, who is the one who's actually going to lead the charge for making sure that the future of cities actually works with the autonomous movement?
It's really, you see handfuls, you see pockets, great mayors who are doing interesting work, organizations of mayors and city leaders who do that. Actually, Bloomberg Philanthropies and Bloomberg Associates is doing great work with cities around the country, around the world, on how to think about this and prepare for this. There's no central organizing body that's really thinking about it.
Anything particular from Chicago?
I just see Andrew eyeballing me over here.
Oh, I didn't realize. I just wanted them to
He's
talk about
stalking
their
us.
careers, though. I missed that point. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
We'll do that next.
No,
Yeah,
but no, seriously, autonomous vehicles in Chicago.
yeah. Listen, it's already happening. I don't know how long, but that will be a game changer. It really will be. So I think it's in the near future. And listen, the cities are laying fiber and power. They're trying to do their best, but it would be helpful to have a cohesive, organized group where that studies could be applied to all the cities.
I know I was just at a convention in San Francisco, and it was so much fun to ride in a Waymo. It's like being at Disney World, and they're coming here. So if you have a chance, if you go to a city where they really are just amazing little creatures that will come and take you around. I came up because we do have questions. Well, as you guys were talking, lots of people sent questions in, and so I thought I would start. I'm still focused a little bit in the Midwest, but one of our students, who I know happens to be from one of those cities, wanted to know what kind of trends you're seeing in the Midwestern cities that might be unique up there and that would provide some incentive for younger people, especially, to stay in those cities as opposed to emigrating.
Yeah, I think depending on the city, you still have a critical mass of job opportunities. For Chicago, it's always been the melting pot for the Big Ten. And that's been the case for a while. So if you look at the population in Chicago, from age 20 to 30, it's actually growing rather significantly. And so a lot of the headlines about population declining is typically the older population is not in the core. So I still think there's a huge draw. It's driven by opportunities. It's driven by having universities that have, a strong tie to that city. So I think it's always going to be there.
Yeah, the other thing I think you're seeing a lot of is there's a livability that, particularly as on the coast, the sort of bigger markets are more and more difficult. There's an ability to have a sort of rich life in smaller Midwestern cities that I don't think exists anywhere else in the country.
I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe not as specifically as this question points to, but one of the things that we face down here in Miami for sure is finding ways to generate housing for people that they can afford close to where they live as a solution to the transportation issues. And if in your work in many cities, if you've seen programs that have been helpful, that maybe we could implement here.
I don't have a specific program, maybe Josh does, but I mean, it's a huge issue here, right? I mean, it's gotten so expensive, and people obviously commute longer and longer. Like New York, I'm sure the same, and San Francisco. So it's an issue. I mean, it has to be addressed because, you just can't have people driving an hour to and from their job. It doesn't work long term.
I actually have one I'd like to throw in there, but I think the city of West Palm Beach has a very interesting program where a lot of the downtown has a very low base FAR. And they use a bonus program that is called incentive zoning, that depending on how much gross building area you have to provide between 15 and 20% of your units as affordable and truly affordable. So 25% below 60%, 25% below 80, 50% below 100. And then the city offers a subsidy through a tax increment effectively to help subsidize that rent. So for projects like my project Nora in West Palm, we will actually be the largest contributor of affordable housing because of all of the incentive zoning that we're using. And it's a very interesting policy that they have within West Palm Beach.
Have you had any thoughts or any inspirations around, I know you mentioned a little bit about wood, but specifically mass timber and some other alternative uses, including, prefab type construction. You see a future for those?
Yeah, I mean, we're building the first mass timber high-rise in Chicago. Took us about 5 years to get that approved. Obviously, Chicago burned to the ground, so they're a little sensitive. So, I mean, but so we can only go up 8 stories, but I understand. So I think that is something we're excited about, and I think once we validate it, I think you'll see a lot more of that.
Yeah, in Chicago, in Toronto, we were trying to go to 35, 40 stories. You can imagine
We got a while to go there.
the challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I think we're a little ahead of our time on that, and you're starting to see. I think timber has incredible potential all around the country.
I will say that we're starting to see geothermal in a lot of buildings, and so they can't generate all the power, but it's the technology is to the point of where they can generate a significant amount. So I think you'll see a lot more of that as well.
Another question I have to ask, because it came up in some discussions, but are you guys thinking at all about some type of office conversion in your cities? Found anything that seems to work?
Well, here's my opinion on it. I think about 5% of the buildings actually work. That's the long short, maybe 10. Just the way the floor plates lay, it's a nice thing to say, but if you actually look at the existing product that could be converted, way under 10% of it actually is functional. So still a good thing. It's still something we need to do, but it's not a panacea for sure.
It's interesting, in Detroit, this is, in a funny way, this notion we were talking about before of skipping a generation of commercial buildings being built. That's what's enabled Dan Gilbert. A lot of those buildings in downtown, which go back to the 1910s through the 1950s, are great for residential conversion. There's very little inventory that has all the challenges of commercial properties as we think about them now. So it's sort of a funny thing that is one little benefit from all of that lack of activity.
There is an act here, for those of you that are not from here, called Live Local, which is a state act, which has allowed higher density zoning along transit corridors through several municipalities. And I know, Joe, you mentioned that, but there's a question about the power of sort of imposed things that support housing that have the potential to generate more, but also have the potential to create some pushback. And Joe, I know 3 people want to know what you think about Live Local, since you dropped that in there.
Oh, no. I had to sit on a panel about Live Local last week for BizNow, and I think all the developers were about to throw stones at me. But to me, Live Local is very well intentioned. Obviously, we need affordable housing. Everybody knows that. The issue with Live Local, to me, is really twofold. Number one, the way that people are working, obviously the unit sizes is really catering to a very particular sliver of affordability, which are effectively micro units that are being charged at market rents under the guise of affordability. That's great for young professionals or young service folks, but that does nothing to address affordability for families. The other element of Live Local that I personally would like to see adjusted or changed, I do think that for somebody who cares deeply about placemaking, and one of the integral components and fundamental components of placemaking is a sense of place and character and fabric. When you spend a lot of time thinking about what building heights go where and why, to be able to have a Live Local project come in and eviscerate those planning principles and create a completely different physical environment is something that clearly, given the work that I care deeply about, would be contrary to that. Lastly, sorry, this could go a long time, but I'll be brief. I live in a wonderful historic neighborhood in Miami. I do believe I'm a YIMBY kind of person, not a NIMBY kind of person. But the restrictions, I think, need to be much tighter about Live Local projects built abutting residential neighborhoods, because the idea of only abutting one side of residential, being able to have a live local project, that would mean that there are historic single-family home communities, or basically any corridor in the city of Miami, which typically has a commercial corridor and single-family homes to the side. Any live local project, grabbing height from a mile away, could be built effectively in your backyard. So those are my little soapbox components or arguments about live local. So throw the stones at me now, it's okay.
Well, those comments give a very good example of what happens when something that is well-intentioned tries to be put into place. And you know, anybody who's even tried to renovate a room in their house knows that anything that has to do with real estate can be very challenging, but also exciting. So I would like to ask, actually all three of you, but I guess we'll start with Josh. What makes it exciting for you? It's not what keeps you up at night, but what makes you excited when the day starts, you know, as far as the next big thing in this business that you're in?
I have to think about that. I just love, I think the notion of the impact that we have. And I mean, for me, it's a combination of knowing that we're shaping cities in a way that will affect so many people. And then also the complexity of it, I find actually kind of amazing.
I would say just creating something out of nothing often, and having it's rewarding. And a lot of times we started off, I think our first 10 deals were all renovation projects, and just taking these old buildings, and Detroit's got a lot of them, a lot of these towns do, and creating into a hotel, an office building, a residential. It's fun. It's hard, but it's fun, and it's great to see the end product.
Joe, what makes you want to get out of bed and go to work in the morning?
Well, local. How was that?
Yeah, live local.
Live local, exactly. Let's just propose a bunch of projects and try to spike up land value. It's brilliant. But no, I think for me, the most impactful elements of my work really came from the early days of Wynwood, the very early days, and being able to capitalize and put small business entrepreneurs into business with capital and space, and to see the success and the impact that that's had, not just on their lives and their families, but on the broader community. And to be able to do that, I think, is incredibly powerful and meant an awful lot to me. Now I think it's just more about trying to be thoughtful about the creation of place and try to create environments that people will find compelling, interesting, and come back to kind of time after time again and have joyful experiences.
But do you guys go to projects that you've already done? Like, do you go back and look and think, like, I did that?
Sometimes, like, what the hell was I thinking? Yeah, I do. I think the most fun deal for us was the original Google deal, because it was literally a frozen block of ice. It took us 2 years to thaw it, and it was just kind of a wild deal. Now it's Google's, Midwestern headquarters. So sometimes you're like, I can't believe we did that, and then it's rewarding to see the end product.
Yeah.
Well, those stories are things that inspire our students. So with that, I would like to thank you for coming, sharing your thoughts with us and the audience. Before you thank them, I would also like to mention that we shrank the networking break for this next session because we are really excited to get to the last session, and then to also know that we can get to the reception where you can finish your conversation. So we have a 15-minute break coming up here, but first let me ask you to thank these panelists who have brought very many new perspectives to us.